Hello again. Many of you now know me from my previous story, but let me again introduce myself to my new friends. I am Time. Yes, the time itself. I was there before the first human ever walked on the land, and I will be there after the last step of mankind. I flow like this falling sand in an hourglass. I stop for no one indeed. Please don't take it as my arrogance. Fact is, I simply can't stop even if I want to. But it doesn't mean that I can't talk with you, or be your friend, or share some stories that I have witnessed. In fact, let me tell you the story of another great man who was in the center of a revolutionary war, challenged all odds, and led America to gain its freedom. He later contributed significantly in giving a strong foundation to a new nation, a nation we know as the United States of America. Yes, my friends, you guessed it right. Today I will be telling you the story of George Washington, an American war hero and first president of the United States. Friends, he needs no introduction, right? Washington is known from the far coast of California to the cold cities in New York and to the warm beaches of Florida. In fact, in my vast millennia of existence, only a few other stories can rival the story of George Washington. His name and his values are still cherished by his grateful nation. The capital of the United States, an entire state in the Pacific Northwest, many counties, townships, and numerous educational institutions are named after him. His face is on the $1 bill and on the quarter. It is also carved on Mount Rushmore, where he will forever be remembered and honored. If you have not seen Rushmore yet, you should visit and see how much effort was equal to all the love of this nation for its first president. Although it's very difficult to do justice to the story of George Washington in a short documentary, even for an eternal legend such as myself, I will try my best to pay tribute to this profoundly notable person. George's great-grandfather, John Washington, emigrated in the 1650s from England to Virginia, and soon became one of the most affluent persons in the colony, mainly through land speculation and tobacco cultivation. George Washington was born on February 22, 1732, to Augustine Washington and his second wife, Mary Ball Washington. He was the first of their 6 children. His father, Augustine Washington, was a very energetic and ambitious man. Augustine acquired much of his wealth through land acquisition, mills, and iron mines. Tragically, in 1743, when George was only 11 years old, his father died. His later life was handled and mentored by his older stepbrother, Lawrence Washington. Lawrence took good care of the young George. He even taught him the elegant art of fencing and military science. Washington never completed more than a formal elementary school education. He was educated in basic subjects like reading, writing, and mathematics. However, he had an exceptionally good aptitude for mathematics. He self-learned the concepts of mathematics, trigonometry, and land surveying. Washington, from a very young age, was interested in military art and land acquisition. In 1748, at the age of 16, he helped in the land survey for Lord Fairfax in the Shenandoah Valley region of the Virginia colony. He was able to impress Lord Fairfax, and Fairfax, in 1749, helped Washington to get appointed as an official surveyor of Culpeper County. For more than 2 years, from 1749 to 1751, he was very busy in surveying for the government. Surveying not only offered him decent wages and travel opportunities, but with his savings he also started acquiring land of his own. Little did he know at that time that his surveying and fencing skills would come in handy later in the Revolutionary War, a war that was waiting for him not far in the future. In 1751, George traveled to Barbados for his brother Lawrence's tuberculosis treatment. In Barbados, he contracted smallpox, which left some permanent facial scars. In spite of the best efforts, Lawrence could not be saved and died in 1752. Disheartened, George decided to return to Virginia. In 1752, Governor Dinwiddie appointed Washington as a major in his army, and thus his official career in the military began. The major had to be efficient, dependable, courageous, brave, and intelligent, and Dinwiddie saw all of that in George Washington. In 1754, Washington participated in the first skirmishes of his career, but this was only a beginning of his long military adventure. In the early part of the next year, in 1755, British forces were attacked by a large Native American force, along with their French and Canadian allies. As an aide to British General Edward Braddock, he fought bravely in this battle, which was later called the Battle of Monongahela. The British suffered great losses, contrary to their expectations. In late 1755, upon General Braddock's death, Washington was made commander of all Virginia troops. Washington fought the French and the Indians for the next 3 years. After the end of the war in 1758, Washington resigned his commission and returned to his estate of Mount Vernon. Experience gained in these years greatly enhanced Washington's leadership skills, which would be greatly useful during the Revolutionary War and his presidency. After returning to Mount Vernon, and until the start of the American Revolution, Washington led a very prosperous, happy, and busy life. He started expanding and managing his lands, entered politics, and served in the Virginia House of Burgesses. In 1759, he married Martha Dandridge Custis. Although Martha and George never had children of their own, he was a doting father to his 2 stepchildren, Jack and Patsy Custis. In the mid-1760s, Britain started imposing undue taxes and other invasive policies upon the colonists. As a result, there was considerable resentment among the general population of all of the colonies. A true patriot, George Washington couldn't remain indifferent to the situation. In fact, it made him a firm believer in American independence. By the early 1770s, Washington started leading citizens in Virginia to openly support resistance to English tyranny. In 1774 and 1775, Washington was one of Virginia's representatives at the First and Second Continental Congresses. The Continental Congress was the group of representatives from the 13 colonies that would eventually become the United States of America. In 1775, after local militia units from Massachusetts had engaged British troops near Lexington and Concord, the Congress created a Continental Army to provide for the common defense of the colonies. Search for the competent person to lead this army soon turned its focus on George Washington. He was selected unanimously to lead and embarked upon a war that was to last 6 grueling years. In accepting command of colonial forces and leading an armed insurrection against King George III, Washington, in the eyes of the English, became a traitor, and if the rebellion failed, he would face grave danger and certain death. On June 19, 1775, he received his commission, and 3 days later he left for Boston, where he found an army of 14,500 men waiting for their commander. Initially, the colonial force was less of an army and more of a large gang, and they lacked any real organization. Its soldiers lacked professional training, equipment, and supplies. Because of the colony's disadvantage in having a much more powerful enemy that was much better supplied and armed, Washington knew he could not face the British directly on the battlefield. Doing this would mean certain defeat. Instead, he used a tactic called guerrilla warfare, in which Washington and his army would strike unexpectedly when the British were the least prepared. He had seen this practiced by Native Americans during the French and Indian War. For the next 5 years, Washington served as the head of the Revolutionary Army. On July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence in the Pennsylvania State Hall in Philadelphia, while Washington and his army were defending New York. He read it out loud to his troops on July 9th with a confident smile. The declaration clearly meant that the colonies were now independent and no longer under British rule. After routing the British from Boston in the spring of 1776, Washington fought a series of battles to defend New York, but he lost many of them. In spite of the humiliation of these defeats, his reputation could not be destroyed. However, all efforts were not lost. Over the years, Washington had developed a very strong spy network. By the end of 1776, he received intelligence that a garrison of about 1,500 German mercenaries hired by the British were in winter quarter transit in New Jersey. On Christmas Day, 1776, Washington decided to do the unthinkable, crossing the frozen Delaware River in a severe blizzard on Christmas Day. Many could drown or die, but Washington's men followed him without question. He led his army through a ferocious blizzard, crossed the Delaware River into New Jersey, and surprised the enemy force at Trenton. On the morning of December 26, 1776, the Continental Army took the Germans by surprise and took about 800 of their men prisoners. Tons of crucial supplies and weapons to equip the American army were now available. Within the next 10 days, Washington's army again defeated the British army at Assunpink Creek, also called the Second Battle of Trenton. This stunning victory boosted the morale of Washington's army and gave his army great confidence and sent a clear message to the British that they were in for a long and bitter struggle. Though not significant from a strategic point of view, the news of Washington's victory raised the spirits of the American colonists, who previously feared that the Continental Army was incapable of victory. Well, my dear friends, they were wrong. America was very much capable of victory. George Washington was a brilliant revolutionary. Although initially he lost many of his battles with the British, his cleverness, brilliance, and decisiveness successfully held his ragtag, hungry army together year after year. In the year 1777, the American army won the Battle of Saratoga, forcing British General Burgoyne to surrender his entire army of 6,200 men. This victory convinced the French King Louis XVI that the revolution was winnable for the Americans. The French began to consider an alliance with the colonial rebels. and in May 1778, the French agreed to an alliance with the Americans, sending troops, munitions, and money. By mid-1779, about 6,000 French troops were fighting alongside the Americans. This French alliance later proved to be the turning point of the Revolutionary War. In the summer of 1781, George Washington received the news for which he had been waiting. The British Southern Force, commanded by Lord Cornwallis, was camped near the shores of Chesapeake Bay in Virginia. Washington secretly hurried his army southward from New York. He deceived British spies with counterintelligence ruses that hid from them the mission's true objective. A large French fleet, meanwhile, had left the West Indies, setting sail for the Virginia coast. On October 19, 1781, after 2 weeks of battle, Cornwallis finally surrendered to the Allied forces of the American colonists and the French. At that moment, British Prime Minister Lord Frederick North, along with the rest of Parliament and King George III, realized that victory over the 13 colonies was not inevitable. American resolve cannot be broken. British delegates were sent to France to begin forging a peace treaty with the United States. 2 years later, on September 3, 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed, and the Revolutionary War officially came to an end. The Treaty of Paris recognized the USA as an independent nation. Against all odds, George Washington and his Continental Army had won the war and earned America her independence, proving that America could make the impossible possible, and that George Washington would be one of the great war heroes of history. By the end of the war, Washington was exhausted and decided to retire from the army. He returned to private life at Mount Vernon. However, my good friend Fate had different plans for him. During the years following the war, America was governed as per the Articles of Confederation, which resulted in a weak and unstable government. It became clear that a national constitution was needed to establish a strong and stable government of the USA. When looking for a man to lead this new nation, there was only one clear choice: George Washington. Washington was called out of his retirement to serve as the first president of the Constitutional Convention of 1787 in Philadelphia. There he oversaw the creation of a document that still forms the basis of American law more than 200 years later, and served as the basis of the national Constitution. After the ratification of the Constitution, the first election for President of the United States was held in 1788, which led to George Washington being elected first President of the United States. The vote was unanimous. The 57-year-old Washington was inaugurated on April 30, 1789 in New York City, because Washington, D.C., America's future capital, wasn't yet built. As president, he lived in New York and Philadelphia. While in office, he signed a bill establishing a future permanent U.S. capital along the Potomac River, the latter named Washington, D.C., which stands for District of Columbia, in his honor. Washington's administration in the government for the next 8 years was marked by the caution, the methodical precision, and the sober judgment that had always characterized him. He regarded himself as president of the whole country and always stood aloof from any party divisions. He selected Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State, Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Knox as Secretary of War, and Edmund Randolph as Attorney General. as the first 4 members of his cabinet. Washington's first term was mostly focused on economic reforms. He was exhausted by 1792 and showed no interest in a second term. But seeing his popularity, he was pressured to do so from all sides. He was unanimously elected again for the second term. The United States was a small nation when Washington took office, consisting of 11 states and approximately 4 million people. And there was no precedent for how the new president should conduct domestic or foreign business. Mindful that his actions would likely determine how future presidents are expected to govern, Washington worked hard to set an example of fairness, prudence, and integrity. In foreign matters, he supported cordial relations with other countries, but also favored a position of neutrality in foreign conflicts. George Washington's presidency was marked by a series of firsts. Being the first president, he established many precedents that still serve the executive branch today. Let me give you some examples. He preferred to be addressed as Mr. President rather than His Majesty or His Excellency. He gave the first inaugural address and first presidential address to the assembled House of Congress. He formed the executive branch into a cabinet of department secretaries, which still persists today. He signed the first United States copyright law protecting the intellectual rights of authors. Under Washington's leadership, the states ratified the Bill of Rights, and 5 new states, North Carolina, Rhode Island, Vermont, Kentucky, and Tennessee, entered the Union. He also signed the first Thanksgiving Proclamation, making November 26 a national day of Thanksgiving, marking the end of the war for American independence and the successful ratification of the Constitution. In 1796, after the end of his second term, he outrightly refused to run for a third term and took retirement from politics. This sets another precedent that no president would serve more than 2 terms. After Franklin Roosevelt's 4th term ended with his death in office, Congress passed an amendment to the Constitution to limit the president to only 2 terms. In Washington's farewell address, he urged the new nation to maintain the highest standards domestically and to keep involvement with foreign powers to a minimum. The address is still read each February in the U.S. Senate to commemorate Washington's birthday. After his retirement, George Washington returned to Mount Vernon and devoted his attentions to his plantation. More than 4 decades of public service had aged him, but he was still a commanding figure. In December 1799, he caught a cold after inspecting his properties in the rain. The cold developed into a throat infection, and Washington died on the night of December 14, 1799, at the age of 67. News of the death of the beloved president brought a wave of national mourning. He was entombed at Mount Vernon, which is now a National Historic Landmark. On his funeral on December 18, General Henry Lee gave the eulogy. Lee described him as first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. George Washington was one of the few men in all of history who was not carried away by power. He was a true army officer, a true politician, a true American, and above all, founding father of the nation. May God bless George Washington, and may God bless America. I will see you again soon with another story of another great man.